Well, I wouldn't define trauma in terms of the events. I would define it in terms of how an individual responds to events and what meanings they give to them, and the residue that those events have left in the soul and the body and the spirit of the person when those events to that person have overwhelmed them. Either too much pain, too much loss, too much shock, too much lack of freedom in how to respond, so that the freezing that occurs, which is one of our natural ways of taking care of ourselves, has the effect of impairing actually the brain, impairing the future capacity of the person to come easily into the present and deal with similar situations which are now in a different context. I think that what Constellation practitioners need to learn is how to recognise trauma and how to deal with it safely in the context of a constellation, and how to see its appearance not just in the individual client but in the representatives and in the quite possibly traumatised elements around, so that you don't exacerbate or go back into the trauma but find new resources both to discharge its effect in the body and to restore the kind of autonomy and momentum that people need to be able to function in their current life. The first thing that I hope people will come away with is a very clear sense both of the phenomenology of trauma so that they can recognise it, which is a somatic sensitivity. It's not just what people say, it's more what's going on in their bodies while they are saying it. And secondly, to know their limits and to understand something about the stages of healing that trauma requires. So it's very important not to re-traumatise people and not to ask them to deal with something which they already couldn't deal with without new resources. So I'm partly teaching people a sort of diagnostic clarity, but I'm also teaching them how to work safely with it. So there are a lot of rather well-established ways of helping people find safety and distance in the field of the constellation, of giving them enormous boost of reception and resourcing before they start tackling the things that they froze about before, and probably helping them find the kind of learn and find the kind of strengthening sentences and actions that restore a sense of space for the soul and movement for the person. And I think also it's to help people understand something about the wider context in which trauma exists, because there are many people in this country who come from backgrounds, whether it's the last two major wars or other fields of conflict that have brought them to this country, where the entire community is experiencing some level of trauma, and therefore people's safe embeddedness in life has been compromised. So I want people, and it is one of the things I'm very interested in, to really understand something about current affairs and recent history and something about the field, the rather savage field that we live in, so that we're looking at trauma both as a property of an individual and as a property of much wider connected systems. The trainings that have arisen out of Bert Hellinger's soulful approach, using these orders of love and so on, which have obviously evolved a lot, but which do draw very strongly on this kind of wider contextual, more spiritual approach. They do differ from other ways of operating, which sometimes have used constellations to work intrapsychically and have looked at the splitting, which is quite a common thing that happens to people when they meet a trauma, that they hive off parts of themselves so that other parts can operate. And that has set up a whole tradition of working with constellations using something called the constellation of the intention, in order to to mend these splits in the soul. And that often seems to be very effective. It's not something that we don't do, but the emphasis, I think, that we bring is much more to look at the enormous resources that exist in the wider field and to find out how to bring them in, and also the resources that exist in the room itself, so that we are intervening quite directly to bring a different shape to an old experience. Whereas I think other forms of training often don't do that. They are so very respectful of the need for a traumatised person to be in charge of everything, because at some point they weren't, that the Constellation goes in a different direction. And I think there is value in both.